Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Farmer, and I am the director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. And I have the great pleasure of welcoming all of you to this virtual program this afternoon, The Past and Future of Democracy, a Case Professorship Conversation, and introducing our 2022 Clifford P. Case co-professors of public affairs, Natalia Molina, Eric Liu, and Jill Lepore. The Eagleton Institute has been hosting the Case Professorship since 1983. When President Gerald Ford visited Rutgers to inaugurate the program in honor of the late Clifford P. Case. Senator Case was a Republican who represented New Jersey in both houses of Congress for 34 years and has also served in the New Jersey General Assembly. A Rutgers alum, Senator Case won a Senate seat as an anti-McCarthy Republican in 1954 and was reelected in 1960, 1966, 1972. He served on the Committee on Foreign Relations, the Appropriations Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, among many others. A champion of civil liberties, Senator Case was known for his willingness to stand up for matters of conscience. He spoke out against Senator McCarthy, opposed the Vietnam War, was a strong supporter of civil rights and the labor movement. He's remembered for consistently putting principle above politics and earned the deserved reputation of having a profound sense of integrity. I want to take a moment to pause here, especially to recognize and thank the members of Senator Case's family who are joining us today for their ongoing support of Eagleton's work to study politics, inspire engagement, and improve democracy. As we thought about the Case Professorship this year, last fall, obviously this is occurring at a critical moment in our history. And at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, we have really lived the turbulence of the last couple of years. The political disruptions, the COVID disruptions, and the social justice protests have all roiled our institute. And so what we thought was we would have a departure from prior years where the Case professors had typically been people like President Ford, Secretary Clinton, other prominent elected officials. But what we really thought we were lacking this year is living the turbulence every day was perspective. And so we're very fortunate to have as our president of Rutgers now, Jonathan Holloway, an esteemed historian, who we thought could really help us gain that perspective that's been missing. So we had a brainstorming session with President Holloway, and the panel that we have today is a result of that session. I want to introduce them to you right now. Jill Lepore is probably familiar to anyone who reads the New Yorker magazine. She is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History and Affiliate Professor of Law at Harvard University. She's also a staff writer at the New Yorker and host of the podcast, The Last Archive. Her many books include one of my favorites, These Truths, A History of the United States, an international bestseller named one of Time Magazine's top 10 nonfiction books of the prior decade. Eric Liu is the co-founder and CEO of Citizen University, which works to build a culture of powerful and responsible citizenship in the United States. He also directs the Aspen Institute's Citizenship and American Identity program. He's the author of several acclaimed books, including his most recent, Become America, Civic Sermons on Love, Responsibility, and Democracy, a New York Times New and Notable book. Natalia Molina is a distinguished professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Her research explores the intertwined histories of race, place, gender, culture, and citizenship. She's the author of the award-winning books, How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts, and Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in Los Angeles, 1879 to 1940. She is also, the envy of everyone, a 2020 MacArthur Fellow. As I mentioned, we're so pleased to have Rutgers President Jonathan Holloway as our convener today to lead today's discussion. A prominent historian himself, President Holloway serves as a university professor and distinguished professor. His scholarly work specializes in post-emancipation US history with a focus on social and intellectual history. President Holloway is the author of numerous books, including his most recent publication, The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans. These introductions have necessarily been abbreviated, and I invite you to look at the program materials to see the biographies in full. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Eric Liu, Professor Natalia Molina, Professor Jill Lepore to this virtual Eagleton stage. And I turn it now to Jonathan Holloway to conduct our conversation. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating.
Thanks for that introduction, John. I really applaud your desire to rethink in this moment what is a fabulous program. The Clifford Case Professorship program is amazing, but for every reason you cited, that we are at a very strange moment. We've been at a strange moment, I think, for a couple of years now, at least. And there is a certain kind of urgency, certainly the way I understand it in this moment as just a citizen, but also as a scholar, as a historian of the United States, there is a certain urgency in terms of how we even think about how we tell our stories of how we got to this moment. And there's a lot to be learned. And for me, a lot to be celebrated, certainly, but a lot to be mourned in that history. What we have today, and for the people in the audience, please don't think I'm being disrespectful. I've already talked to my panelists. We are using first names. Part of it is because it would feel weird for me to use their official titles and last names. This is this session, Clifford Case Professorship, is really called Friends of Jonathan. That's the subtitle. I've had the incredible honor of knowing Jill, Natalia, and Eric, and I met them in that order. Jill going back to 1990, 91 or so, something like that, when we were in grad school together. Natalia, when I was in grad school, and she was a summer research fellow, part of a summer research program, and I was the mentor for the program probably around 92, I'm guessing. I didn't actually look it up. And Eric and I have met most recently around 2014, put together because people understood our shared interests in citizenship and service. So for me, this is just, I'm going to have fun. So I'll try to restrain myself in my enthusiasm and not just get into personal stories. But we are really lucky to have this group of people together with us today, because as you will see, their work coming from different methodological spaces, different kind of voices, senses of history, senses of being very of the moment and being very contemporary. I think you'll see some overlaps here that are really, I think, really going to be instructive, and I'm hoping quite generative. And what we're going to do, so people understand how this will work, is I'm going to open up with a few more specific thoughts, some prompts for our three professors here, or the case professors, and then we will get to the Q&A, and to have a conversation, get to the Q&A. So this hopefully will be really a lively give and take after each of our case professors gets the chance to put a stake in the ground on some area of particular interest or passion. Now, I'm a historian of the United States, specifically the African-American past. And so I think often about what it means to write history of a people who were deemed for a very long time to not have history. There's a whole larger conversation about that. We know that to be the case, of course, but for the longest time, it was how to give voice to the voiceless. And telescoping out from my own methodological interest in that issue, I think we're at a moment in our society where we are wrestling with what it means to give voice to the voiceless. And whether it's through whether you consider the hyper democratic possibilities of social media or the hyper demographic possibility, that's not the right word. Oh my gosh. Demagoguery of social media. You know, there is a lot to be wrestled with in terms of how we understand time, space, history, the present, and what the voice is. What does it mean to be an American is ostensibly a simple question, but I think it's actually the most complex question we can ask. And that's what I know I share this interest in, this puzzlement with our panelists, and that's where I want to head. So I want to begin with sort of an opening frame here, and I'm going to quote Natalia from 2020 when she was designated, bestowed with the MacArthur Fellowship, and had a video. And she observed, if we understand the many factors that shaped where we are today, then we have the power to reimagine where we can go from here, which I found to be a very eloquent wrestling with time, frankly, and circumstance and possibility. So this is sort of the way I'm thinking about this whole meeting today. And then I'm going to now turn to our respective panelists with that sort of concept of belonging across time and space, sort of lingering out there, and then get more specific. So I'm going to turn first to Jill Lepore, and to start really from a place of understanding the history that has shaped our present. And I want to invite you, Jill, to share in broad scope the exploration you undertake in your 2018 book, These Truths being those which Thomas Jefferson articulated as political equality, natural rights, and the sovereignty of the people, all very loaded terms. So when we think about these truths, Jill, how are we doing? What's the record? What's the record of integrity to these truths in this country?
That's a very big question. First, just to say what an honor it is to be with all of you and with all of you in the audience. Sorry, we're not all together gathered in a community. I think our longing for that is a big part of where we are right now, and kind of, I think, always needs to be spoken and invoked and not sort of take for granted that this is a natural way to have these conversations. So yeah, I think the question, trying to sort of apply some kind of a yardstick to our political ideals across time, is one that animated me when I decided to try to write this long history of the United States, as much because I really wanted to understand the origins of those political ideas as I wanted to understand their force and their impotence, really, as well. So the book that I wrote, These Truths, we don't really even get to the Declaration of Independence till a few hundred pages in. It's a 1,000-page book, and I wrote a long book purposefully. I mean, there was a lot I wanted to say, but I also sort of wanted people to pause and actually ingest information at great length, and not necessarily accept my interpretation of American history by any means, but take the time to really wrestle with it. And one of the things I was really struck by when the book came out, that speaks to your really great question, Jonathan, and Natalia's formulation of the nature of our own kind of the moral seriousness of this moment, is that I found that, so the book came out not long after Trump was inaugurated. It came out in 2018. And a lot of people read it and assumed that I had written the book to explain the rise of Trump, which not only takes place only in the last like 3 pages of the book, but also obviously I've been working on the book for many, many years. So, you know, events that happened in 1702 and 1814 and 1897 and 1912 were not chosen to narratively set up the rise of Donald Trump. Like, these were things that actually happened. And when I explained to people that, in fact, when I wrote the book, I was always assuming that the book was going to end with the inauguration of Barack Obama in January of 2009. It was a comfortable distance in the past. It is a great ending for an American history book that's wrestling most centrally with racial injustice and the incompatibility with that form of injustice and the appeal to liberty and justice on which the nation is founded. And I kind of had to tack on the Trump stuff. And so what it revealed when I was sort of talking to people, I was like, it is actually the same history. Like, the same series of events gets you to Barack Obama in 2009 as gets you to Donald Trump in 2016, because the nation's history is not always moving in one direction. It's moving all the time in multiple directions. And the argument, the sort of Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, arc of the moral universe argument, is that on the whole, it's moving ultimately more in one direction than in the other. But, you know, day by day, we see it moving in 2 directions, you know, reading the news. I think that's why people have a sense of having their heads reel all the time. I mean, on the one hand, this seems to be happening, but on the other hand, this seems to be happening. And it's sort of always been that way. But I think what's challenging culturally about that is, because of hyperpolarization, which is now automated because of social media and a sort of machine that you can't tinker with, you can either just break it entirely or escape it. You can't actually fix the machine. That most people have in their own minds one version of that history or the other. That is, you know, very highly partisan account of centuries in which the story of the emergence and progress of the United States is a story of one atrocity after the other, or a story, an account in which that history is a series of triumphs, victorious wars, moral progress. And if the people who live in the country have completely opposed accounts of the nation's past, it is very hard to figure out how to go forward. And there's a sort of no sense of yielding to the evidence on either side, I think, at the extremes of the camps, when the evidence, of course, is just mixed. And to your point about, the urgency with which I think you and I went to graduate school to do this work of recovering these voices, that work's been going on for more than half a century now, and it is incredible. And there is an extraordinary trove of archival material and monographs and scholarly articles, generations now of African-American scholars, Chicano scholars, Native American historians, Asian American historians, women's historians, people interested in LGBTQ studies have actually done all that work. That work is out there. It actually needs to be woven into a whole story, not a bigger story, because that is a big story, but it all needs to be somehow woven together. And that's really hard work. And the way we've sort of set things up right now, the people who are doing that hardest of all possible hard work are public school teachers who are disrespected, underpaid, undervalued, harassed, not given job security. I think we could spend our whole session talking about how communities ought to be supporting public school teachers and public schools as one way to think about how this problem and how organizations like the Eagleton Institute begin to think about addressing it.
I have like lots of notes. See, this is going to be Jonathan's problem, because I could just keep going on asking all kinds. I could really nerd out in, social history methodology, grand narratives and stuff, but we have other panelists. So this is a great opening for us, Jill. Thank you very much. And we're gonna turn to Natalia, and I'm taking notes. I'll re-engage all these different themes on the other side of this when we get to the conversation. So don't think that, Jill, you just offered a really eloquent narration and I've just ignored it. I'm gonna do my own weaving. We start to figure out the larger questions that you invited us to wrestle with. So years ago, I was on a visiting program in Xiamen University in Xiamen, China, where I was leading a one-week seminar on American studies. These are Chinese grad students coming to Xiamen to hear from a few professors in American studies. And it's an old thing to say that professors learn more, teachers learn more than the students do in the course of a class. I think it's true, actually. But on this particular occasion, a student said something that really unnerved me because of the truth that she offered into it. And she said, I was sort of asking, I can't even remember the prompt anymore, to be honest, but it was about race in the American experiment. This is a Chinese national saying, and who spoke English, but it was a second language. She said, well, without race, America loses its meaning. Now, I heard that as someone trying to figure out the right idiomatic way to express something. Or I think that's what she was doing, but I heard it in a very, very different way. That without really wrestling or thinking about, or the deep truth of whatever race is, America loses its meaning. So Natalia, you think about this stuff a lot. So I want to invite you to add another layer to Jill's opening comment, my musing here for a moment, to unpack the incredible multitude of ways that, using your title, how race is made, and how it has made our history. How can we understand our shared history, our diverse lived experiences through your theory in Race is Made, of racial scripts, for example? Well, you can say whatever you want. That's one way to start off the conversation. So,
if there were graphics in the Zoom that could represent what's going on in my brain, it'd be like, because your opening concepts of, we're responding to that question as scholars, but as citizens. We have also lived through these moments. We have also experienced great loss, and been a witness to this incredible part of history and time in history, and thinking about how we might make sense of it methodologically. Maybe one place to start, because I am a historian, and since this is the Eagleton Institute of Politics, I do want to give a sense of what we do. And so maybe giving a sense of the kind of research that we do that can get at your question. So, and what inspired this is your your mandate, your inspiration to your university of thinking about it as a beloved community, one in which is a place of inclusion and equality, where everyone from administrator to custodian is recognized. And when I read that in preparation for today, I was reminded of some of the research that I did for my first book, Fit to Be Citizens, in which I went to Mexico City because I was looking at the history of Mexican immigrants in the US, but their history often is not here. The archives for it, they're back in Mexico, because whenever they had grievances, they did not appeal in the early 20th century to US officials. So that already tells us something about democracy, right? They're here toiling, they're here, they're not allowed to be in unions, housing isn't provided for them. And so when they have grievances, they ask the Mexican consulate to help them. And I found this letter from in the Secretary of Exterior Relations, where the Mexican consulate houses its archives, documenting the 1916 typhus and the way that the US dealt with it. And so the idea was that Mexicans were disease carriers, and that therefore when they entered the United States, they needed to be sterilized. They needed to kind of be make sure they were free of disease. And one might think, well, that seems objective, right? Of course, if Americans crossed into the US and then crossed back, they didn't need to be. So we see that disease is more associated with bodies than people. Well, a local jail adopted the practice, and the way that the delousing would occur was through kerosene gas, through soaking their bodies with gas, through soaking their clothes with gas. A local jail adopted it, and there was a spark, something happened, and the jail blew up in flames, and all those people there died, many of them Mexicans. And the people who'd been crossing also were laborers. They're people that came every day. It's the US and Juarez, so it's a border town. And this is a history that so few of us know about unless we study it, unless we read these academic books. And I was really reminded about that. I was reminded about the story of reading Your Beloved Community, because during the pandemic, when we saw this kind of repeat of history, as many of us were fortunate enough to be able to work at home, work on Zoom, keep our jobs, we saw that people had to go out and toil under these incredible conditions, meat packing factories where people knew that they were working side by side with people that were diseased, people that didn't get any time off during the pandemic, people that said, laws that said if you go back to work, you can't sue your employer. So again, making these vulnerable populations even more vulnerable. And I was out one afternoon, late afternoon, and the mayor of LA would give these, speeches, kind of, where we are in the pandemic speeches. And I was listening to it on the radio, and at the end, he signed off with talking about a custodian. So to your point, Jonathan, a custodian at LAX, Salvador Barona, who had died from COVID. And so they were going to light up these towers that are outside of LA Airport in honor of him. And I thought, wow, it was almost like 100 years later that we're honoring workers. So to me, when we think about how race is made in America, we need to also look at what are all those precarious conditions that make up race. And so much of it is tied to work, to capitalism. In my book, How Race is Made in America, I also talk about this notion of racial scripts that, and this goes back to Jill's point that I just so agree with it. We now have so much history. We've had ethnic studies for a good, 50 years, solid history, LGBTQ history, gender history, ethnic and racial history. And yet so much of it is still marginalized. And when a lot of that history developed, it developed as Latino studies, Asian American studies, African American studies, Native American studies. And I think one way to weave it together is for us to think about the interconnectedness of those histories. And so I come up with this theory of racial scripts to say that the attitudes, policies, narratives, structure, all of that creates this idea of race for one group often connects to these other groups. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily, working together, these groups. I'm not talking about comparing them, and I'm not saying that they're working together, but the kinds of attitudes about race that we create around citizenship, around democracy, that either include or exclude a group at a certain time period might then go on to affect those other groups. And I bring this up also, and I'll connect back to the first part, which is, during the pandemic, I got asked a lot, because I wrote a book my first book was on public health and race. So I was, interviewed by the media a lot to talk about that issue. And, the question is always like, are you surprised at these attitudes, the anti-Asian racism, the rise of anti-Asian racism during the pandemic? And I was like, no, no, right? History, if we know our history, we know how we got to this moment. And many people, if we look at it through kind of that silo of Asian American history, there's so many episodes that show how we got to this moment. Yes, there's the 1882 Exclusion Act, but there's so many moments after that in terms of alien land law acts that don't allow Asians to own or lease land for more than 3 years, that prevent them from having citizenship, that inter them, on and on. But if we also weave in that history I just told you about these Mexican immigrants, we see that in general, immigrants' racialized bodies are otherized, and disease was a way to do that. And so I hope that one of the ways that we weave these histories together is to see our common cause with groups, and to see that, we need to also recognize each other's histories and weave them together if we're want to get at this beloved community.
Thank you. Also very powerful. I'm reminded very soberly back in 2020, when the pandemic, when this virus was spreading in the country, we finally knew that it was here. It'd been there already for a bit. And then George Floyd was murdered, and I was in Chicago, Evanston, Illinois at the time, and we were all watching these protests happening locally, then nationally, then globally. And someone asked me in Chicago specifically, why now? Because these are multiracial, ethnic protests, marches. I'm like, well, I think now everybody understands what it feels like to be inconvenienced, because we're all at home, we were all anxious, we didn't necessarily know. I mean, you remember back then, the toilet paper run, like where were supplies? Like, but this is daily life for a lot of people, for a lot of the people who clean our buildings or provide our food. And so I think that through really horrific tragedy, coupled with anxiety of invisible nature, because they don't know where this virus is, then we got to a point where of being deeply destabilized. And in that moment of being destabilized, perhaps, in my most optimistic sense, a sense of possibility and opportunity, of being people discovering somehow ability to be empathetic to somebody else's daily life. And that, even saying that feels like a bit of a stretch, but I still want to believe that's a possibility. And that is part of the idea of the beloved community, something that I've talked about since I arrived on campus. And it is not about agreeing with one another. It's not about being similar. That's in fact quite antithetical to the beloved community. But it is about recognition that all these different things have brought us to this moment. All of these truths, to go back to Jill's work, I had my question wrapped around, with these different narratives. They brought us Obama and they brought us Trump. I mean, all of these dynamics, and what you were just talking to Natalia, is doing the same sort of work, recognizing sort of invisible narratives that are now those stories are being told, or at least being heard in some ways. And that's exposing all these stresses. And I want to turn to Eric with this. He's got the real challenge of going third in this series of opening declarations, as it were. But to think about the idea of a beloved community, not what I'm talking about, not what I've articulated, but the phenomenon of it, that it is really recognizing an incredible diversity in this country. I mean, a beloved community is hard. It is not an easy thing to do. But both Jill and Natalia have been talking about sort of the constellation of identities and experiences that have brought us to where we are. And how, given all of these challenges, in terms of that dynamic, the dynamics that undergird that, how do we create a beloved community? And this is, I wasn't using those words in Eric when we first met, but this is stuff that you've been deeply committed to for as long as I've known you, and quite longer than that, of course. And to borrow specifically from your 2019 book title, How Do We Become America? Which I take it as a wrestling with sort of where we began, like our ideals and our reality, and they are not in the same place. But how do we become that?
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for framing up this conversation this way, and just Jill and Natalia, just thinking about the things that you've opened up. This is, I'm glad we're spending, the better part of the day together here, because there's so much here to explore together. There's a few things, Jonathan, that really strike me. I want to commend you and John for reimagining the case professorship this way, as a form of dialogue rather than one person, holding forth. What I've learned about Senator Case and the legacy that he'd left, formed in part by Rutgers, was one in which he was able and willing to engage across difference at a time in public life when doing that was very risky. When a McCarthy era where all the incentives, even for people of some conscience, was to retreat to the safety of a position in which you knew you would not get punished, and he was willing to lean in and take some of that risk. And I think that idea of risk is important here, because, as you've said, a beloved community is hard. It's there's nothing about anything we've heard either in the present day or in the histories that Jill and Natalia have begun to unspool here that should make us think this is just a matter of sloganeering and feel good stuff. And let's be honest, the phrase beloved community itself, which Dr. King used a lot, like another of his phrases, about the content of our character and so forth, it often gets either superficially or somewhat maliciously hijacked to actually make an argument against the very equality and the very forms of justice that he was fighting for, just to say, hey, can't we all get along, right? There is a notion of beloved community of, hey, can't we all just get along? And I think what you're naming here is the way in which, well, two things. Number one, what we are trying to do in the United States is hard because it hasn't really been done fully or well in human history yet, to create a mass multiracial democratic republic where everyone is in fact, not only on paper, but in fact recognized and empowered with voice and the ability to shape the fate of that society. It just, you look at those marks: mass, multiracial, democratic republic. Different societies in human history have hit one or two or three of those marks, but nobody yet has successfully done all four. And it remains an open question whether you can. That quote that you cited earlier from your trip to Xiamen, China, from your interlocutor there about you can't understand America without, that if you take away race, you can't make sense of America. Again, we don't know exactly how she meant it, but I would interpret that slightly differently, which is you can't make sense of America without understanding the tension between race and our creed, right? It's not just race as a fact in isolation, but that tension between universal ideals of equality, equal protection of the laws, justice, equal justice under law, and the sheer facts, the scale of which are still beyond the reckoning and recognition of so many Americans. And still, when we try to interweave stories of the kinds that both Jill and Natalia have been talking about today, and certainly in their works, into the conversation, then you get a lot of the politics that we see right now around critical race theory or around the teaching of civics, where everything becomes polarized and zero sum, that, oh, if you're going to start talking about people of color, then you must surely be wanting to obliterate the history of white people. Well, no, but that's interesting that you think that, right? And I think that underlying psychology of why is it that people think that has a lot to do with the challenges of creating beloved community. To me, the idea of creating beloved community cannot simply be a commitment to be nice and to love thy neighbor, important as that is. We have in our work at Citizen University, we're a nonprofit organization based in Seattle, but working all around the United States in different creative, place-based, bottom-up ways to cultivate a sense of powerful, responsible citizenship. And all these ideas, culture, cultivation, citizenship, I think is worth unpacking a little bit. When we talk about citizenship, I'm not talking about, in our work, documentation status under the immigration and naturalization laws of the United States. I'm not talking about passport holding or the right papers. I mean this broader ethical conception of being a member of the body, a contributor to that community, and someone who has a claim to presence and the shape and the fate of that body. And the way we define that more capacious notion of citizenship is often through this simple equation that I think gets at both the challenge and the opportunity of building a beloved community. And the equation is this: power plus character equals citizenship. That to live like a citizen in this broadest sense requires, in the first place, a fluency in power, right? It's not just a matter of can't we all get along? Can't those who have repeatedly, generationally been cut out of power just learn to get along a little better with those who have repeatedly, generationally hoarded power? No. we have to be able and willing in the first place to name differentials in power, to understand who has power, what forms power takes: money power, people power, ideas power, social norms power, the power of state action, to understand who does not have that and why that's been that way, what justifications and narratives of, as Natalia said, disease and otherness, or fitness by their nature or their faith to be entrusted with power, to understand that both history, but also, again, the practice right now. What does it mean to practice power right now, to organize people, to change the frame of the possible in our civic and political life? That's one huge part of the equation of what it means to live like a citizen and to create this beloved community. But the second part is equally important, because if all you have is that fluency in power and you get skillful in learning how to move people and ideas and money and social norms and government action in ways that advance your ends and aims, but that fluency is completely untethered to a moral framework, to an ethical core, then what you're getting simply is really finely highly skilled sociopath. And that sociopathy is in high evidence all around us in our political culture today. But it's also, again, if you look honestly at our history, it's been there from the beginning. It's as much a part of our story and our history, the sociopathy and hypocrisy, as is the aspiration of our creed. And so when we talk about civic character, we don't mean individual virtue, right? So much of the character conversation in the United States is about the personal. Do you individually have grit? Do you work hard? Do you persist and persevere in the face of obstacles? And we love to celebrate that kind of character in American life. And I'm all for that. There's nobody here in the panel or in the audience got here without some quantum of grit. But I mean character in the collective, a set of norms, values, habits, ways, mindset and heart set that is about how shall we live together? How shall we actually include each other? And these are values of reciprocity and mutuality, of service before self, contribution before consumption. And most fundamentally, back to the idea of beloved community, the idea that we're all better off when we're all better off. That the elevation of those with the least power and voice and agency does not create a zero-sum game where those who are current incumbent holders of power are suddenly diminished, but it actually makes the whole, the body, healthier. And for a brief moment, as you said, Jonathan, the pandemic at the beginning was this little glimmer of a sense of, wow, we may as Americans may begin to learn this. We may suddenly remember that it's not every person for themselves, that we're all better off and we're all better off, that you can't sever your fate off from those who are suffering, that you can't look at somebody who has to work 2 shifts, lives in an apartment with 5 other people, has to go to work even if they're sick, and look at them and say, wow, bummer for them, glad I'm not them. Because in a pandemic, you are them. In a pandemic, when they are serving your food, caring for your grandparent, riding the bus with you, you are them, right? And for a brief moment, we could imagine that a beloved community was one where we did believe we were all in it together. And I would say as the pandemic has unfolded, that that spirit has evaporated in many ways. But our work at Citizen University is about trying to create, and this is what I want to close with, just trying to create invitations to people to rekindle that sense of belief that it's possible. You said, I wrote it down, Jonathan, I still want to believe. You use that phrase, I still want to believe that a beloved community is possible. And I think it's really important to underscore this dimension of what it means to create the beloved community, that it does begin in the first place with a certain leap of civic faith. I often say democracy only works if enough of us believe democracy works. It is fragile and evanescent and dependent upon this millionfold mutual agreement that this should mean something. And if we show up and participate, it will be responsive to us. But you don't get that belief just by wagging your finger and saying to people, you should believe harder. I know you're suffering, or I know you feel cut out, but believe harder. This is democracy. It's good for you. No, the way you do that is to invite people into a space where they can name the ways in which they have lost faith, in which they have doubt about whether this thing is going to work for us. And that can be immigrant families whose histories are one of completely betrayed faith going back generations. It can be stories of white working class people in the Rust Belt who thought they were believing in a possibility of this country and have seen it unfold because of forces beyond their control. It can be across the board if you are open to a sense of empathy about connecting those dots. But that idea of inviting people into those spaces in the first place to name their disillusionment is the first part of actually restoring a sense of mutual faith. And that book of mine, Become America, is a collection of what we call civic sermons delivered at these gatherings that we've begun to organize called Civic Saturdays. Civic Saturdays are a gathering that are essentially a civic analog to a faith gathering. It's not church or synagogue or mosque, but it has the arc and the flow and the feel of it, of such a gathering on purpose, to invite people from different backgrounds to come and make sense of our times together and name the ways in which, we see the world differently and we have our fears and our doubts, but there's something about being together that reminds us that that's the work of exercising that muscle of being together, right? And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity that we have here, and why, Jill, I appreciated your opening this whole conversation with saying, you can't just drive past the fact that it's weird that we're doing this way, remotely and through technology, that there still is something precious about joining each other, as we will again soon, in person to build that community relationship by relationship.
Thank you for that. This is, my concern has been realized in that everybody was so darn interesting that we are going to be running short on conversation opportunities and questions. We do have some interesting questions I want to get to, but I want to, this may be the only piece of the conversation, but I invite all of you to chime in, keeping an eye on time, and is to betraying my sense of my interest in history, and all of us are historians of different eras and different types. This is embarrassing because I can't remember who wrote this, and I'm paraphrasing it. The past is never over. It's hardly ever past. I mean, I've mangled it. It's a great Southern writer. Can't remember the name. But I want to start with the provocation. 1619, 1776. These are dates in the past. Things happened, but they're also very much with us in this last couple of years. And they are tripwires, as it were, a glimpse into our current state of the state of our mental health. And I really mean that quite literally, mental health as a nation in a pandemic. What do we make, how do each of you briefly make sense of the furor that, the New York Times 1619 project saying, hey, let's ask different questions about the genesis of this nation. Where do we start? And the despair that people sincerely felt. I don't doubt their sincerity, that doing so would do violence to this really important moment of revolution in 1776. That there's something about America is being said in those dates, and also in the way that this was debated. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, because I think it resonates along with something each of you have been talking about.
I can jump in here just to say briefly, I guess the headline for me is I think it was a really unproductive public contention. I don't think much progress was made on mutual understanding or, in your terms, beloved community. I think a lot of it was media contrivance. There was just a lot of hype around both projects, frankly. I, for one, will just say, and this is an impolitic thing to say, but the version of American history that the New York Times has been telling for my professional scholarly career has been the 1776 version up until Nicole Hannah-Jones's project. So it's fascinating to me the way in this story somehow the New York Times represents this new progressive, race-centering, brave, courageous reckoning with American history when, I mean, I think any of us who read the New York Times book review since the 1970s know that, you know, it really reviewed, you know, Joseph Ellis and David McCullough and presidential biographies of Truman and Eisenhower, and that was the version of American history that the New York Times celebrated. So I find just even the antagonists in this story false media contortions, honestly. And I think it's also easy to forget what I think was actually in some ways a much more powerful public deliberation in the 90s with the 1992 anniversary of Columbus's voyage, in which there really was a really generative and important discussion of indigenous history in North and South America and Central America and around the world that I think was by contrast quite generative and important by way of, you know, museum exhibits and curators and school teachers grappling in a deep way with these things. Because 1992, for all the similarities and sort of reductionism of some of that discussion, was just empirically, we know the American population wasn't as politically polarized. So the 1776-1619 thing was just really, to me, really very narrowly ideological. I think takes us kind of a few steps back from doing the important weaving together, in which I think we, you don't choose your history. You can't, like, it is a field of humanistic inquiry that is answerable to evidence, and the evidence is of an incredibly contested, highly violent, highly idealistic national culture of many different kinds of communities. So I don't want to go on about this because I don't want to give kind of more airtime to it. I really tried very hard not to talk about this dispute because I feel like it hasn't been a productive one.
Well, I think you're right, exactly. And I also think, and you know, I love your work and respect you greatly, but you answered it like a professional historian. It's the same way I would have answered it so many times. But when I think about this, the debate that was generated, there's no doubt about it, but it tells us about us, like in this moment. And I mean, if I don't want to make social media just the bogeyman in all of this, but if it existed in 1992, what would have happened then? I mean, I really don't know, but I do know that
I guess, I'm sorry, I just don't know that it tells us about us. Like, I just think most Americans have no idea what either of these projects were. Like, I think I'm pushing back slightly just to say, okay. I think it's a kind of Twitter war and mostly that. And I think conservatives in some states have seen they could win elections, state offices, by making a big deal out of it. The same with critical race theory, but that doesn't, I just don't think that means it's a genuine dispute.
I mean, I think both of those points can be true. I mean, there is a fakeness to the binary of 1619 versus 1776, and it begins to take on non-fake, real political consequences, both in those states where elections are being won on the basis of anti-CRT bans, but also more broadly where the freedom that we began by really singing the praises of public school teachers in New Jersey, around the country, the latitude that public school teachers have to ask questions, not even say stuff, but ask questions. The chilling effect of this debate is real enough for enough of these educators that that I am concerned. But I think that the thrust of what Jill, you said, I couldn't agree with more. I mean, here's the thing. We in this room are among the few civic nerds in the country who probably have read both the 1619 initial report and book and the 1776 curriculum that Hillsdale College created, and that grew in part out of President Trump's 1776 commission. And what I found as I read through both of those was how, to use a different phrase from our cultural literacy, don't believe the hype. Like the challenge that there is far more overlap between them than you might guess, and that the flaws and faults of both of them are more with omission than with outrageous affirmative claims in either, right? And that a common sense view taken by most of those people, as Jill is saying, who have no idea what we're talking about, 1619 versus 76, but if you presented this to them, they'd be like, isn't the real answer some mixture of the two? Like, isn't the real answer some undertaking of understanding what was in fact revolutionary in the context of its times, about the idea of self-government and under rule of law, while also coupled with the deep and often hidden reality that from the outset it was being betrayed by enslavers and other people who had staked their claim to the land through genocide and other means. Like, isn't there some fusion to be had here? And I think that's the thing that we are charged with doing right now, is both embodying it and telling that story of there's a synthesis to be had right now. And our politics is stupid right now because it's all thesis and antithesis, and no one has incentive to do synthesis. We gathered together something like this, and all the people, including the young scholars who we'll be hearing from later today, are people who have to take responsibility right now for actually showing what's possible when you break out of that binary.
This is great. Natalia, we've heard thesis, antithesis, and look to you for synthesizing.
Yes, well, I'll go for scale.
Okay.
So on both Jill and Eric's points. So let's look at the ways that it was used productively. I'm one of these people that was, I can still be naive about things. So when it came out, I used it as in my call for the Organization of American Historians. I was, the chair of the conference. I was like, oh, this is great. The humanities have been saying that, we're suffering. Our numbers are dropping since the recession in 2008. Undergrads want a much more practical major. This will revive history. This will tell a public story. This will engage us. And then, nope, in this moment, bloop, it was divided. But some of the people that did use it so well were teachers. Yes, to your point.
Use it meaning the 1619. That's what you're referencing.
They came up with curriculum, and part of it was just asking students, where do you see yourself fitting in this narrative? There's these wonderful projects. You can go to their website and see some of their projects in Chicago. Students going out into the urban landscape and finding statues that commemorated a public history, connecting it to democracy. So, one of the ways that we can use it is to scale down, scale into our own built environment, scale into our own public sphere. And, as Eric says, when we talk about democracy, really we're talking about being a part of a whole, a part of a body. And for many of us, that's our neighborhood, that's our city. And we don't even see ourselves reflected there all the time, let alone a nation. And so the 1619 Project also in their curriculum gave ways for people to connect in that way.
Thank you very much. We have some questions. I really truly could go on, and we're going to run out of time, but I'm going to be very disciplined. I want to get to at least one question that was already submitted. And I've invited us to talk a lot about history. I'm going to make it much more present. And I don't know who's going to, it's open to the three of you to engage it. And this is a quote from a question, from a staff member at the Eagleton Institute. Some conservative groups are backing the passage of legislation that will make it more difficult to vote and possibly overturn decisions of local election officials. How can we uphold our democracy when our votes are not represented? And how can we ensure that everyone's vote is counted? So this is in the spirit of Eagleton being an institute of politics, quite literally.
Well, I'll jump in with some initial thoughts. I think in the first place, I mean, the question does state the challenge. If we can't is the short answer. We can't sustain democracy if voting itself becomes rigged and hijacked to the extent that it no longer, it does not actually reflect the preferences of the people. But I think there's two things to say. One, I will dip back into history. One is to remind ourselves that it's always been rigged in different ways. It remains rigged to this day, even prior to some of the things that are happening under the aegis of the big lie and desire to kind of take over local election administration in ways that might end up being harmful. We have a history in this country of different ways of using both facially neutral and unabashedly unneutral ways to block people from actually exercising their voice through the franchise. And I think it's worth remembering that history because what it's also a history of is people organizing continuously to push back against that rigging of the game. And that the only thing to do right now is to organize, right? I mean, power concentrates and power will justify itself at all times. But the thing that saves us from those two laws of power is the one that is the fact that power is infinite because we can always generate new power by organizing. We can generate countervailing power by pushing back. And I think rather than treating ourselves as spectators watching people take over local election administration, those who care about it have to start organizing in the places where it's happening to keep an eye on it. That's number one. And then I think secondly, a couple of us were involved. I had the chance to co-chair a commission of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences over the last few years on the practice of democratic citizenship. And we came out with a report called Our Common Purpose with 31 recommendations of how we can reinvent our democracy. And a set of those recommendations were about how to make voting more meaningful for people. So not just accepting the current system of voting, but something like ranked choice voting, in which people recognize that their choices across these often false binaries of a duopoly of party politics leave a lot of people cold and leave a lot of people saying, what's the point of participating, right? And so I think in addition to fighting the bad, which is fighting people who want to rig voting systems to deny people their voice, we've also got to start pushing for the good, more inclusive, more expansive, more open ways of having voting conducted so that more people, more of the time, see themselves in more of our representation.
Beautiful. Either of you have a quick, go ahead, Natalia. Yeah.
If I could just give a quick example to Eric's point about, pushing back. One of the interesting moments of that in Latino history is in the 1990s with Proposition 187, which denied services to undocumented. And really the way it was written in terms of social services, health, education, you're really talking about women and children. And so what we really gained from that was this knowledge that, oh, it's okay to have immigrant laborers, undocumented laborers, if they come do the work and then return home. But it's this whole different thing if they have families here, if they stay. And it sparked a fire within the immigrant community, documented, undocumented, their citizen family members. And there were just marches of 100,000s of people throughout the nation in major cities and small places. And what you got from that movement was people deciding to enter office. So many of the people that are now, especially, and I know California politics the best, that are running for a mayor now, that are running for city council, that have been mayor, that have been, assembly leader, came out of that movement. So this movement in which they were supposed to be disenfranchised, they turned that on its head. And now we're seeing this new iteration of that in LA politics, where one of the women running for city council, Dulce Vasquez, is formerly undocumented, but she takes her notion of civic pride, of democracy, of being from South LA, and not just as Latina, undocumented immigrants, but also growing up in South LA with Black neighbors and wanting to have that that civic pride of what it means to be an Angelino and understanding that region and wanting to fight for it. So just to follow up on Eric's point.
Very quickly, I don't know if I just was about to cut you off, Jill, but very quickly, I hadn't even thought about this until this moment. We have, granted, we're talking metropoles here, but Seattle, Los Angeles, and Boston, and New York City, I guess one would say for my location, represented in this room. And that represents the corners of the country, well, a triangle of the country, not one corner in particular. And it leaves out a lot of things as well. That's something I just noticed in this conversation. But I want to, and there's more to unpack there. Unfortunately, not a ton of time. I want to merge two questions here together. They're pretty, I think they speak to one another. And Jill, I'm going to come to you first with this, so be prepared. We have a question from a student and then from someone who sent in a question live. And I'll just read them literally here. How do we deal with growing misinformation in the public discourse while still being able to critically question authority? First question. The second one, as historians, how do you see the decline in civics education fitting into larger cultural trends and playing into the present moment? So I think there's some tension here about our present moment, senses of history, discourse, and information. So solve this for us, Jill.
Okay, yeah, in 5 minutes. I just wanted to add, just to amplify what Natalia and Eric had said about things you can do to help with voting, to just kind of put pressure on colleges and universities. That, one of the proposals that came out of the commission that Eric and I both served on was election day should be a federal holiday. People should not have to go to work on election day. Everybody should be able to vote, and people work long hours and it's not okay. And I think election day should be Veterans Day. I don't think we need to add a federal holiday. I think we honor veterans by making it possible for people to vote. But further to that point, I think college presidents have to get together and start that by having election day be a college holiday universally throughout the United States so that college students can vote. College students on campuses all over the country have been lobbying for this. Here on my campus, there's a Harvard Votes effort trying to get Harvard to make election day a college holiday. That needs to happen. And there are people here who can make that happen, who can start making that happen. So I just think that's a really important piece of what we can do locally.
That's called shooting your shot, Jill, with the president on the phone on the line right now.
That's why I'm doing it. That's why I'm doing it. Eric told me that power is limitless if we only speak to the people who hold the power. So I'm trying to organize you right now, Jonathan.
Love
yes,
it.
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
But to the question of misinformation and also civics education, I would say I spent a lot of the last month visiting civics classes in high schools. There's incredible civics education going on in this country. Like, I think it's maybe a little too easy to say civics education isn't happening. It's true that some states, many states, dropped civics education, after the Vietnam War, kind of in a sense of that it was a kind of jingoism, felt wrong to people. Civics education is necessary, but I think even when it's not taught in a course that's called US Civics, there is civics education. My city's public high school teaches global civics, which is a kind of comparative civics program. I think there really is quite a lot of it going on. And one of the things I've noticed about the high school civics classrooms I visit is that they double as media literacy classes of necessity, for just the reason that you saw these two questions as the same, Jonathan, right? You can't exercise your duties as a citizen if you don't have access to good information. So one of the things high school kids are learning is, how to be discriminating about the information that is out there. And I think, in fairness, high school kids are way savvier about dealing with sources of misinformation than are really any other age group. So I'm kind of least worried, honestly, about high school students and their ability to tell, is the latest kind of COVID conspiracy theory true? Like, I think they get it. It's more a question of kind of to Eric's work, how do you get adults to get civics education again, outside the context of a classroom? And I think there are really interesting experiments going on at public libraries in towns and cities, in different neighborhoods of different cities. I think there's a lot of energy around that. I do think that were election day a federal holiday, it could be a day where there are kind of pop-up civics instruction classes, pop-up deliberations. I mean, the three pieces of being a citizen are representation, participation, and deliberation. So you can participate by voting, but you need to actually deliberate and represent your views and listen to other people representing their views. So I think there just need to be, honestly, more gatherings in which people work out how they could possibly see a problem so differently, including the problem of voting, right? I mean, I think it's easy, in our discussion of voting, seem to believe that anyone who's interested in passing voting laws that we're going to label voting restriction laws, many of the people who support the candidates that are advancing those laws are really genuinely, earnestly worried about election integrity. They may be misinformed, but their heart's in the right place. They want to have free and fair elections. And they believe that elections are being stolen, some of them, because they don't have good information. And like, it takes some work to then say, I hear you, that you're really concerned about elections. So am I. What do we share? We share a concern about elections. How do we do that deliberating? That's something I would like to see happening in town libraries and city libraries on election day.
I'm going to go ahead quickly.
I love what Jill's saying, and particularly this idea. And this is a message really for the people who are in the room with us, participating in this session today, in terms of what you can do. Jill just named what everybody can do, and that is join a club or start a club. I think that the practice of association is so fundamental. And we're in a time right now where it's not going to be a president who saves us, or even a college president who saves us. It's going to be the bottom-up flowering of a lot of small associational experiments in public libraries, in communities, community centers, faith organizations, where people are re-exercising this muscle of dealing with people unlike them, trying to figure out where they see the world the same, trying to figure out how to disagree better where they don't, but also taking responsibility in a way that's not about spectatordom, right? And I think so much of what is implicit in what Jill was saying is, just had to, representation, participation, deliberation, with the possible exception of representation, but even there, none of these is about leaning back and sitting and watching the show, right? All of them are about how do you lean in and engage somehow. And I think we've got to, there's no magic to this. This is just, in Rawa, in Trenton, in whatever part of New Jersey you're in right now, take ownership and organize a few people just to do something right now. And I don't mean to be overly broad, but it doesn't even have to be about civics or politics initially. It is about this practice of joining and forming in a way that actually will enrich that kind of base layer of the topsoil layer of the garden of democracy.
Wow, I've never been more happy to be interrupted or to be spoken over. That's the topsoil of democracy. It's beautiful. And I really quite agree with you. There are, we get beguiled, I think, as a consuming public and overwhelmed by the enormity of the task in front of us, no matter what our political position is, no matter our views of civic engagement and stuff. But I think, in fact, I know each of you have spoken about things happening at the local level, the high school classroom, the library. Libraries are incredible civic spaces, and so much work of what I would call something much closer to democracy is happening in those spaces than anything else. And what I do think is really quite important, that especially during the time of the pandemic, that we've never lived through something like this before. We're all trying to figure out, we are all stressed, angry, hurt, scared, anxious, whatever. One word that we haven't used today, and it's not a failing, we just haven't used it, but I think I want to close on this word, is the word grace. And that we are in a deficit in this country right now. And there has been many moments in our history when we are in a deficit situation in terms of being able to grant grace to another person. And I really do believe what Jill was saying is correct, that a lot of people who are being figuratively tarred and painted for really being concerned about the integrity of the vote may be coming from an actual place of concern about the integrity of the vote, but that they are being fed a different set of facts. I'm not saying everyone is like, there are a lot of bad actors out there, but I do think we get a lot further by extending the notion of grace to try to find people where they are. We may not ever convince them to see it from our perspective. We may not ever agree, but by reaching out the hand, that's an act of grace, we're actually doing something. And I think too often these days, that hand that is being extended is being met by a punch. I mean, just to extend the metaphor in a silly kind of way. So we really have work to do in this nation to try to figure out how to talk to one another, how to hear one another, how to be okay with disagreement, for goodness sakes, and with different perspectives, because that is actually what democracy is all about. Although we have been culturally trained to not think of it that way, but I think that's what it is. It is messy and it is hard, and it's a group effort, frankly. So a number of questions came pouring in as we moved into the Q&A the conversational phase of this, and I couldn't get to them, of course, but I appreciate everybody who did contribute live questions and those who contributed to sent in questions beforehand. The questions that I received yesterday did shape, just seeing if I didn't even read your question, which I basically didn't read most of them, but it really shaped the way I approach it. So I hope that you heard in this conversation some of the things that you were wondering about. I want to thank everybody who is in this conversation. I'll get to the panelists in a second, but for the audience, the over 250 people who were here at one point, who are curious enough and wanted to take some time to sit and wrestle with these ideas. And I'll close with this. I mean, this is something I picked up from Eric when we first met, is that there, and it does speak to grace, but he was talking to me about ways of structuring conversations between people who absolutely don't agree with one another. They will never agree with one another on issue X. But if you start that conversation by pointing out the things they share in common, the nature of the disagreement will be different. To me, that's a beloved community. I use this all the time when I'm talking to people at Rutgers. It's like, I do not expect you to agree with one another, but we all are at Rutgers in some way. Can we please hold on to that as a common purpose or a common ideal and use that to build from? Because if we are strong enough, we can manage through the differences as long as we recognize there's something holding us together. And to me, that is actually a grand American ideal, as naive as it may sound to your ear. I choose to invest in my naivete, I suppose, and hope for something better. So we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists specifically, Jill Lepore, Natalia Molina, Eric Liu. Thank you for coming with all of your energy and insight. And I love the pushback moments. That's actually perfect as well for the Q&A session. Thank everybody again for coming. We're going to take a break for a few minutes, and student fellows at Eagleton, our panelists will be back to see you at 2:30. And that will be, I think, a very lively conversation. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you all so much.